with William Dalrymple. The session is sponsored by Amity University. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Jaipur. In the week that the corporate sector seems to have taken over the American presidency, it's probably worth recalling that although we still talk about the British taking over India in the 18th century, it was not the British government. It was something far more sinister. It was a multinational company, one of the first of the world's corporations, and from the beginning, in their initial charter, they had the right to wage war. There is, thankfully, nothing quite like the East India Company in the modern world, Trump apart. There is today no corporation which has a fleet of nuclear submarines or can call in airstrikes. Some corporations, such as Shell, may have a small militia, but there is nothing to match the East India Company, which by about 1820 had a private army twice the size of the British army, and which used that army to take advantage of the vacuum in India after the defeat of the Marathas in 1761. And the East India Company replaced the Mughal Empire to become extraordinary, a company ruling a continent. It's one of the most extraordinary stories in history, and we've gathered together for your delectation this afternoon 5 extraordinary writers on the East India Company, all of whom have covered intriguingly different aspects of this very complicated and very sinister beast. And over the next 45 minutes to an hour, we're going to look at the history of the company and talk over its modern legacy. Maybe we could start with John Wilson, who's just written an extraordinary book, which I highly recommend, called India Conquered, which has come out at the same time as Shashi's book and is a very interesting counterpart to it. And there will be another session, lucky given the popularity of this one, another session comparing the two books tomorrow. Is it tomorrow? But for now, John, would you just open by talking, how was it that this company was founded? What was it? It was a new thing, the company. I mean, the actual idea of a company even was a fairly new thing.
Yeah. We have this, or there used to be this idea that before the British conquest of India, before the middle of the 18th century, the East India Company was this kind of trading body, this peaceful trading body. And that's not the case. It was founded after a series of discussions between merchants from London at the end of the 1500s, very beginning of the 1600s, because traders believed they need some kind of political force, some kind of might, and including some kind of military might in order to trade in Asia. And so a group of traders from London, and the company was from London and not from Britain, as Willie said, got together and persuaded the Queen Elizabeth to kind of give them a charter that gave a group of traders the right, the monopolistic right to trade with Asia. So no other British trader was allowed to trade in the subcontinent. And in that form, in that kind of body, this coming together of traders into a single organization in this new way, which had some kind of political power, which was able to bear arms. You have some kind of seed, I think, that potentially leads to, kind of all kind of violence, kind of later on. And just that this is a very peculiar body. It's always debated. It's always criticized by other Britons. Kind of a few years later, a group of kind of enemies of the company in Britain described it wonderfully as an absurd, monkish, fantastic and fanatical body. So it was seen as a kind of an alien kind of force even in Britain.
Could you just talk about the idea of the company? I mean, up to this point, in the 16th century, most businesses in the world were family businesses. When Marco Polo sends expeditions to China, he's trading as a family. Ditto traditional Hindu merchants trading, say, between Gujarat and Africa. Yeah. But the corporation was a new idea.
It was a new idea. There are in fact many organizations called company, but they're they're really like guilds at the time. They were associations of private traders, associations of family traders, as you say. But the East India Company was a new thing in that it was a joint stock company in which acted as a single economic body. It made money not on behalf of the individuals who worked for it, but for a single stock and for the investors back in London. And that was seen by the merchants that we're talking about here as the only way in which it was possible to make money, because you needed this big, powerful, strong political entity. But what's important...
Plus you needed a lot of money.
You did need a lot of money, but it was possible to make money in other ways. There are still private traders who go to India, and this is, this is not necessarily the most economically rational thing to do, actually. There are private traders who go, who went to India, who made money, who did deals with the Mughal Empire even. And the East India Company got incredibly anxious about those private traders who were able to make money without being a company. And that's something that feeds into the kind of later dynamics.
And two big precedents before this, the Muscovy Company and the Levant Company.
That's right. So you've got these two companies, the Muscovy Company and the Levant Company, but neither of them has quite the same desire for monopolistic control over the trade between Britons and other regions of the world. So Britons are trading in lots of places. They're banding together in companies, but the East India Company is new in the sense in which it gives kind of military power and monopoly and is kind of single joint stock in precisely this kind of form, and that's new.
And this produces the question later on why these other companies, like the Muscovy Company and the Levant Company, sort of just flounder and fail while the East India becomes a state in itself, a company state.
Largely that has to do with the way the company negotiates with politicians, I think, in Britain, and that's the vicissitudes of factional politics. I mean, it happens to also find markets where it can make money, which is, which is an important part of the story. But throughout the 17th and late 17th, early 18th century, its success depends upon the deals it can do with sovereigns. So, in particular, King James II becomes a great ally of the East India Company, and so it becomes something that it becomes an organisation that has enough money to be able to sometimes bribe, kind of political powers in London in order to kind of support it. As I say, it's important to recognise it's always debated. In Britain, there's never a consensus in favour of this kind of organisation. It's always seen as some kind of alien body.
Shashi, in his book, has wonderfully taken apart the idea of all the traditional things that Britain is meant to have given India, a unity. I think you still allow us giving you cricket, but about that's it. But the idea of a company is an idea which started in London and which is now, I mean, most people in India will spend most of their days working in a company.
Yes, I mean, it's not a great deal to be grateful for, but yeah.
You're a politician. You spend your time in Parliament.
The British bought in the company here. One of the interesting things the British did, of course, was also ensure that a significant number of parliamentarians in Britain had stock in the company. So there was a vested interest in making sure the company got political support when it needed it.
This is a very important point. And so, for example, when Clive takes Bengal, he takes it with British Army troops, with British Navy ships, which are provided at taxpayers' expenses, but it doesn't go to the Crown as an asset, it goes to the private shareholders of the East India Company. And that is largely because half the people in Parliament have got shares in the said company and make a nice tidy profit on the rise in the share price. Now, before I read the wonderful books by Giles Milton and John Keay, particularly Nathaniel's Nutmeg, and preceding that, The Honourable Company by John Keay, I had always been under the impression that the East India Company was primarily, as I think most of you probably still do, was primarily about India. But it turns out in the early part of the company's history, it was not about India at all. And the East Indies referred to in its title are not actually referring to India at all.
In fact, you're absolutely right. The East Indies, to your lace-ruffed Elizabethan mariner, stretched all the way from the shores of India right across what is now Malaysia, Indonesia, a huge amount of the Indian Ocean with the islands which produced the spices that they wanted to bring back to London. These were the Moluccas, the fabled spiceries that they were trying to get to. The first voyage set off in February 1601. It was led by a gruff sea dog called Sir James Lancaster. And his goal was Bantam in Java, which was something of an international port in those days. It was certainly the centre for the spice trade. It was where shipping came not only from Europe, from the Dutch, from the Spanish, from the Portuguese, but also from as far afield as China and Japan. James Lancaster got there, and he decided, he filled his ship with spices and sailed back to England, but not before leaving a number of what became known as factors behind him. These factors were traders, and they were to stay and buy spice when the ships went in port, because of course any time an English ship sailed into port, the prices went up. The idea was if you had a permanent presence there, you could buy the spices when they're at their cheapest, then you load your ships when they arrive, and quick turnover back to England.
And what were these factories like? They're
Bantam-
not sort of smokestacks and belching.
No, they were not factories, in fact. They were trading posts. They were warehouses, really. Bantam was a hideous place to live, by all accounts. It was surrounded by malarial swampland. Half the people who were settled there, the few people who were settled there, they died of dysentery and all sorts of dreadful diseases. And it was realised that, actually, as James Lancaster realised, that instead of staying in Bantam, why not sail even further east, to the spiceries themselves, to the islands where these spices grew like weeds? So off they set sail, the furthest flung of all were the Banda Islands, 6 islands, the only 6 islands in the world where nutmeg grew, and nutmeg was the rarest and most costly of all the spices. So they went there. And they found...
I mean, just a quick sort of byword here. Why spices? I mean, today we don't associate, selling peppercorns with immense riches. Why was this such a special thing?
Well, for 2 reasons, I think. The Elizabethan age was the first great age of luxury. Spices were rare, they were valuable, they were costly, and to have a few nutmegs sitting in the centre of your table meant that you're a very wealthy person. They were also...
Sort of 16th century equivalent of sort of Louis Vuitton luggage or something.
Exactly, yes. So there they were in the centre of your table, but they were also believed, quite wrongly, to cure the plague and cure a number of nasty diseases that were going around London at the time.
And to be Viagra.
Of course, it was believed, yes, absolutely, to boost one's libido. Another reason why the prices were very high. So James Lancaster, he brought his spices back from the Banda Islands, but there was a problem when he got to the Banda Islands. And that problem was that the Dutch had got there first. The Dutch East India Company, a rival operating at exactly the same time, only with rather more ships and rather better weaponry. The Dutch, unlike the English, who were setting up a trading company, well, the Dutch were setting up a trading company, but they decided that it was even cheaper if instead of buying the spices, you simply seized the islands where these spices grew. So there began a great battle for control for the global monopoly of, in this case, nutmeg. From there,
They also had a more sophisticated stock market, didn't they? They knew how to raise money more efficiently. And
yes, so they had more ships, they had more weaponry, and certainly more investment in the project. And this really counted against the English when they started to move out. You see, the English were carrying on their ships English woolens. This was one of the great trading commodities of Elizabethan England.
Just what you need in Bengal in summer, a nice tweed coat and a
exactly
woolly
the
jersey.
problem. This was the problem, that you arrive in the Spice Islands, they're hardly the place where you want to wear a thick English woolen coat. So this took the English even further afield, and they ended up in 1611 going to Japan, where they thought it was slightly colder and there might be some more need for English woolens. And they set up a factory, a trading post in Japan. And from there, they traded with Siam, they traded with China. They were trying out markets, really, trying to find places to sell their woolens. And just on Japan, it's a very interesting story. They found when they arrived there was already an Englishman living there, William Adams, who'd arrived as a virtual sort of castaway, shipwrecked mariner in 1600. He'd settled there, he'd learned Japanese, he'd become an intimate of the shogun, he got a position in the shogun's court, and he helped negotiate trading rights for the East India Company in Japan.
John Keay, in your wonderful book, The Honourable Company, which to date is really still, for anyone wanting to follow this up today, is still the standard text on the East India Company and an incredible overview. You radically changed all our perceptions of the East India Company by devoting only 2 or 3 chapters to India. Almost everything else is China, Japan, Indonesia.
Yes, and also to a very limited period in what you're talking about as the company's reign of power. I think we need a bit of chronology here. The company was founded in the year 1600. it didn't start acquiring territory in India on any scale until 1750s. So the first 150 years of the company's existence, it was primarily a trading outfit, trading in all these out-of-the-way places that Giles has been speaking about. In fact, it wasn't interested in territory. It actually tried to avoid acquiring territory, and very often it would set up a factory that he was talking about on an offshore island rather than on the mainland. And various attempts were made to found trading establishments, trading factories on the south coast of Vietnam, on the west coast of Borneo, in St. Helena, of course, in the South Pacific, South Atlantic, all over the place. They were setting up these trading places where goods would be accumulated by a merchant on the spot and be ready for a ship when it came to call. And they weren't interested in territory or in becoming involved in local politics if they could help it. So that was the company for 150 years. Now, it only lasted in the maximum extent 250 years. 150 years until the 1750s, and then, of course, it acquired territory in Bengal, here in India, and from then, for the next 10 or 20 years, it behaved appallingly, and no one would want to try and defend that record.
We'll let Shashi do that bit.
But thereafter, in other words, from the late 1770s, and particularly from 1784 onwards, I would maintain that the company had no independence at all. It was a scapegoat which the British government used. The British government controlled the company. They nationalised it, in effect, by the India Bill of 1784. And the company itself had responsibility. It was like a branch of the civil service, but it was answerable to government, to the British government. And the British government, in fact, used it as a scapegoat. When things were going well in their terms, then they took the credit. When things were going badly, they blamed the company. And so we're dealing, when we talk about the iniquities of the East India Company, the iniquities were restricted to a very narrow period, for about 20 years in an existence of 250 years. So I think that's important because we need the chronology. The second thing is that we were talking about the geography. It was called the East India Company, and the Dutch company was called the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, because to distinguish the East from the West Indies. It wasn't because it had anything to do with East India. The whole of the Indian Ocean basin.
It's not about Orissa and Bengal, in other words.
Sorry?
It's not about Orissa and Bengal. It's the...
No, I mean, it anticipated its arrival in Bengal, if you like, but it was originally, India was a generic term for the whole of South and Southeast Asia, and even East Asia. And the company was involved in all sorts of enterprises. Actually, the most profitable enterprise it was ever involved in was not growing opium, but in exporting tea from China to the United Kingdom and to the United States and to Europe. Tea was its most profitable business ever, by far, much more so than spices would ever have been, or than opium. In other establishments...
It was East India Company tea that gets dumped in Boston Harbour.
Exactly that, yes. And it's dumped because it's being so heavily taxed by the British government, not by the company. The moment the company reduces taxes on imported Indian tea, then the company's trade shoots up dramatically. And this was a sort of quid pro quo in terms of the government, in return for the government taking over virtual control of the company. The government agreed to reduce duties on tea from 125% to 12%. And so the tea trade suddenly became immensely profitable to the company.
Giles, could we just wind back a little bit before we get into the 1780s and 1790s, still go back to that period when it's the Dutch and the British facing off in Indonesia? Could you just give us a 5-minute synopsis of the whole Nathaniel Nutmeg story? Because it is the defeat in Indonesia that leaves the British with trade with India as the remaining option.
Yes, the English really invested a lot of their hopes in the Nutmeg Islands, in the Banda Islands. As I said, these were peculiar because there were only 6 islands in the world where nutmeg actually grew. And the Dutch were very well aware of this, and they decided that if they could seize these islands, they could prevent the English having any spice at all, and they could set the global price for nutmeg. What happened is they began to seize these islands by force, They would capture the native headmen of these islands, and they would torture them and kill them, take over the islands, build forts, because once the local population had been taken care of, then they had to block the English, make sure the English didn't get there. What happened is that the Dutch ended up controlling 5 of these islands, but those pesky English managed to hold on to one of the islands, thereby depriving the
island
Dutch,
of Run.
The island of Run, which lay some 10 miles to the west of the main group, which meant that the Dutch were deprived of their global monopoly. And there was to be an extraordinary siege of the island of Run, where the hero of my book, if you like, Nathaniel Courthope, and a very small group of men held this island for many years against a far superior military Dutch force. And just sort of to wind up the story of what happened is that eventually the Dutch would seize the 6th island, and they would get their global monopoly on the nutmeg trade. In retaliation, the English sailed across the Atlantic and seized the Dutch-held island of New Amsterdam, Manhattan. And in the ensuing treaty, where all these problems and territorial issues were wrapped up, the English got New Amsterdam, which was renamed New York, and the Dutch got their beloved Nutmeg Islands.
So the British arrive in Surat, they build factories there, and what's the date of the first British voyage to India?
I think William Hawkins arrives in, 1608, and then very soon afterwards, within the next 6-7 years, England sends an ambassador to the Mughal court as well, Sir Thomas Roe. And actually, one of the very interesting things he produces at the end of his tenure in India is a letter to the East India Company advising them on the future of trade. And he's looked around, he's studied what the Portuguese, the Spanish and the Dutch have done. And he says, do not go down the road of seizing territory, do not construct forts and castles, don't bring garrisons here, they will be a drain on your resources. He said he wanted to elect for, as he put it, a quiet trade and trade only.
But that doesn't happen, because in the meantime, Nadir Shah comes down from Afghanistan, from ultimately Iran. He takes the Mughal Empire by the scruff of its neck, departs with the entire accumulated wealth of the Mughal Empire, and in the anarchy which follows in the next 20 years, there is a gap left. The Marathas are defeated by Ahmed Shah Abdali a little later in 1761, and then in the 1760s, Clive takes Bengal. It's caught up in the Anglo-French rivalry. The British Navy is sent because they're at war with the French, and Clive defeats Siraj ud-Dawla, and there then follows one of the darkest periods of Bengal history, Shashi.
Right. Well, actually, one can go back a little earlier because, even though everyone is right that the East India Company was essentially only interested in trade, they had also taken the Hindi word loot into their dictionaries and their habits, so that there had been a fair amount of loot taking place in the decades before. One can't
It's actually
forget,
one of the first Hindi words to enter the English language.
absolutely. Loot. Shampoo was another one, coming from shampoo.
We weren't very good at washing at that point.
That's right.
We didn't have many words in our vocabulary.
For washing. In any case, but in this particular case, the word for washing your hair actually came from kneading it, because champna is actually to massage the head, which is what their servants did for them. But no, I was just wanting to point out, for example, you can't overlook the fact that the British did control territory around Madras. They essentially created the settlements for Fort St. George and Fort St. David, created Madras, and governors of Madras did rather well. One was Mr. Elihu Yale, whose fortune helped found Yale University.
Another was Mr. Pitt. Who had the
Mr.
Pitt
Thomas
diamond.
Pitt, who apparently got hold of this diamond. Whether he purchased it or prized it from the eye of an idol, we shall never know. But it made him not only a huge fortune, but established a dynasty that produced a couple of prime ministers a century down the road. So the British were doing well out of trading as well, and increasingly control of the ports became an extremely important way of regulating opportunity. But from 1757, the victory of Clive of Plassey, and then the expansion of the...
And the interesting thing there is that it isn't Siraj ud-Dawla in a sense that's the initial target. It's an Anglo-French struggle. The British take Chandanagar, which is often forgotten. They actually conquer the French thing. And then almost as an afterthought, go after Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who's been the French ally.
Correct. Because, well, of course, they assumed, rightly, I think, that Siraj-ud-Dowlah would attack them on behalf of the French. So there was, in a sense, a multi-front war going on. And then they found a very useful ally in Siraj-ud-Dowlah's court, who proceeds to give them money to place him on the throne in place of Siraj-ud-Dowlah.
And again, interesting with this whole question of corporate influence. I mean, today, obviously, it's a huge issue in any Indian election. Who's giving money to what party? Adani, your own party has not been known, Shashi, to turn away donations offered.
Do you know any political party that does? I mean, the fact is that in this case,
on the table or below it.
Mir Jafar pays the company to replace Siraj-ud-Dowlah on the throne. Then Mir Qasim comes and pays a new set of company officials to replace Mir Jafar and put him on the throne. And then Mir Jafar comes back a few years later with even more money. So
but
the
the
British
crucial
India
role
Company was doing...
Here, just to interject this one, the Jugget sets. Tell us about the Jugget sets and their role. These are Marwari merchants.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that you actually had an extremely well-developed banking system and trading system in India. The Jugget Seths were only part of
coming out of this part of the world.
Absolutely. There were Chettiars in the south. It is estimated as much money in formal circulation in the Indian banking system as was dealt with by the entire Bank of England. And equally striking, we talked about trade earlier, the fact is that India was already a very well-established manufacturer and exporter of textiles. It was the world's leading exporter of textiles, to the point where there are records going back to Elizabethan England of English shopkeepers trying to pass off shoddy English-made goods as made in India because they could command a higher price, since Indian goods had a higher reputation in Europe than they did.
Shashi, just give us an idea of the relative economies at this stage, the size of the Indian economy and the GDP versus the
Well, it's estimated, Angus Madison has done calculations that are broadly not contested. And about 1700, India was 27% of global GDP at Aurangzeb's peak. Aurangzeb's revenues alone were 100 million pounds, which was by far, by multiples, greater than any of the other great. The Sun King in Versailles had a fraction of what Aurangzeb
and
was
Agra is the size of London, Paris, Rome, and Lisbon put together.
Put together, particularly in terms of population as well as in terms of art, architecture, the various splendors. In fact, Hawkins was mentioned. When Hawkins first showed up, he was utterly stunned by the contempt with which he was treated and the insults accorded to his monarch, who wasn't thought of very highly by the Indians because he was seen as very much a lesser king, King James II, by comparison with the Mughal monarch reigning at the time.
Akbar calls the Europeans a convocation of savages.
Well, there you are. William always has the right phrase to hand. But the fact is, when Thomas Roe came, he had already heard that he'd better be suitably deferential. By then, Jahangir is on the throne, and the first ambassador. It was actually, we celebrated 400th years of Indo-British diplomatic relations going back to in 2014, because that's when Thomas Roe shows up at the court of Jahangir in Delhi, and he's very deferential, something which I think we shouldn't forget. The gap between the opulence of the Mughal Empire and that of any European court, as William has just pointed out.
John.
So coming from the... Sorry, John.
I was just going to say, go to the wonderful exhibition at the city, in the city palace in Jaipur. And there's a series of Jaipur miniatures and so forth, but there's a map of Surat, a large cloth map of Surat. And in the far top left-hand corner of this map, you can see a tiny little Union flag. Surat is probably India's biggest port, and this is from the 1680s or so. And, kind of like sort of representations of different trading nations. And there, right in the top corner, very insignificant, is Britain.
So,
just on the point of the English turning up, this was exactly the same in Japan. The Japanese were absolutely appalled when these stinking mariners turned up at their shores and had no knowledge.
They didn't
of
bathe
Japanese
more than
etiquette.
once a few weeks.
Yeah.
Shashi said, Clive...
But anyway, coming back to the...
The Jugget sets fund the British takeover of Murshidabad. Tell us about that.
Well, the British... I would argue the East India Company did decide that the best way to actually dominate the trade was by conquest. Now, tracing when decisions are made, how it was done. But you're right, the Jagat Seths were in the business of lending money. That's what bankers do.
Marwaris from the Jaipur region.
I believe so, yes. Well, Marwaris from the Jaipur hinterland and beyond as well, I should imagine, but from Marwar. But anyway, the fact is that they did help finance this, and the British...
The Jagat Seths, I understand it, their job was to transfer the annual payment of the Nawabs of Bengal, who were the Mughal governors in Bengal. They had to pay a certain amount of tax every year to the Mughal centre. And the Jagat Seths were the banking mechanism for that.
They were the banking mechanism at all levels. So in other words, there were lower levels that paid to the Nawabs. And that too went through the Jagat Seth channels. And then from the Nawabs to Delhi. The banking system was fairly sophisticated. I mean, today we hear about Hawala and so on, but a lot of that was well established for centuries. So in any case, coming back to the British, don't keep pinning it on the Jagat Seths. They're merely financiers. The guys with the guns are the ones we have to think about. So they come in, and indeed the conquest of Bengal proceeds, which was at least in part. I mean, there's obviously one part that was about just looting the treasuries of Bengal, and there are accounts of Clive walking through this collection of gems and riches available in the treasuries of Murshidabad and Dhaka, and just, wondering where to stop and how he could take as much as he wanted. But in any case, apart from everything else, there was also a question of the textile industry. The company decided at one point that they could not, in fact, succeed merely by buying Indian textiles and selling them. They actually had to destroy this industry. And they did so pretty systematically. In Murshidabad, they destroyed most of the looms. Remember that East Bengal is where some of the finest muslin was being made in the world. Muslin as light as woven air, it was said, which was, of course, being exported to Europe.
Buff Tower.
Absolutely. And you had, for example, the Dhaka gauzes, which the finest ones could be pulled through a ring. An entire yard of cloth could be pulled through a ring. It was just very, very exquisite work. So the British decided to destroy it, essentially, in order to eliminate the prospect of competition. And they did. They destroyed large numbers of mills. There's population figures for both Murshidabad and Dhaka that show the depopulation of these cities as a result of East India Company's destruction. Weavers were thrown out of work, looms were destroyed. In at least one account, and I say this with some diffidence because John is almost certainly going to tell me that this is contested, but in at least one account documented by a contemporary Dutch observer, the company also cut off the thumbs of some of the weavers so that they couldn't weave again.
It's what we call a fake fact.
A fake fact, a post-truth fact. This has been the allegation of some British historians, which is why I'm very careful to say in one documented, footnoted account by a Dutch observer. Now, maybe out of commercial rivalry, the Dutch were telling lies about the English, but we don't know. They might have been telling the truth. In any case, it's passed into oral legend. I heard it growing up in India about the British cutting off the thumbs of weavers. The fact is the weavers were not able to function, and that India went from being, and here there's a lot of contemporary scholarship, from being the world's largest exporter of textiles to being a net importer of British cloth.
We had a session yesterday on the Second World War Bengal famine and Churchill's culpability in that. But by 1771, for the first time in many years, there was a massive famine in Bengal.
Well, the British also started controlling the revenues, and they, India's taxation, taxation is taxation, nobody likes to pay taxes, but there was a cultural tradition of fairly decent attitudes to taxation. That is that, for example, it was a widely established practice. If somebody had an illness in the family, they weren't taxed either at all or as heavily. If somebody had a marriage in the family, same thing. If there was a drought, the tax was waived or reduced. There was this kind of flexibility to the tax system, which disappeared with the English. When the English came, they had their rule book. They said, this is the percentage you will pay. It was also the highest percentage recorded in many parts of India. The lowest we know that the East India Company ever charged was 45% of the year's crop. Very often it went as high as 85 and 95%. And they were ruthless in their exaction of these taxes. As we know from accounts in the House of Commons during the impeachment of Warren Hastings, the ways in which peasants who couldn't pay were mistreated, tortured in public squares, stripped and humiliated in public places and so on to make them pay and make their families pay.
Linda,
really
do you think that the tax collecting method, say, of the Marathas and their chout at 30% and sometimes raised to 40%, would have been so very different?
I think I'd like to
Closer.
open the discussion up a bit, partly by introducing a female voice, which would be good. Okay? But I'd like to open it up in another way by saying, well, can we look at this more globally? We've already seen trade across the oceans being summoned up in these wonderful contributions. But one of the things that interests me as a global historian is the way that violence in different parts of the world is going up sharply in the middle of the 18th century. It's a period of tremendous warfare, competing empires, both European and non-European empires. For example, in the 1750s, the Emperor of China, a man of immense culture, writes poetry. He sends his legions into Mongolia, as it now is, and basically they commit genocide. They slaughter the males, the boy children, they rape the women, or they kill the women if they're past the age of raping. And the younger Mongolia Empire, as it then was, which had been around since the 17th century, basically disappears. And that appalling episode is happening at the time that Clive is plundering Bengal in a new way. And you see another huge carve-up of territory, this time in Europe, in Poland, which is invaded by Russia, by Prussia, by Austria, and divided violently into three. Huge casualties, appalling loot. And it does seem to me that that's not remotely letting the British off the hook, but it is saying that what happens in parts of India in the middle of the 18th century needs looking at in broader context. The other point I'd like to make is that I think we've got to be careful about these big monolithic terms. The British. Well, there weren't that many of them, of course. In 1780, in the East India Company armies, British soldiers, 1 in 4 die every year. They are outnumbered 7 to 1 by Indian-born soldiers. So the British presence is numerically small. But I think it does come down, of course, like so many things, to money. Indian scholars who've revolutionized this period have shown that many Indian kingdoms are raising troops, carrying out interesting experiments with taxation, developing, as we've been told, textile industries. But the East India Company, while small in number, has a range of fiscal skills, both drawing on Indian fiscal skills and fiscal skills in London. And this is where it does speak to what corporations can do, that it's a very small group of men, but they are able to manipulate money, and that, as part of a wide range of global developments, really changes the nature of world
I think it's
history.
important just to, again, put in context. So by the time that you've got all these horrors going on in Bengal, the British establishing themselves increasingly in the south, the whole operation is controlled from one tiny office block in Leadenhall Street, 5 windows wide, with as late as the 1760s only 35 permanent staff. So it's a tiny multinational with one tiny office that's creating mayhem around the globe, from India, China, Boston Harbour, And again, sort of, a precedent for multinationals we have today.
It's just worth pointing out, it's stating the blindingly obvious, but you couldn't just pick up the telephone and ring somebody who's out in Bengal either. It would take 6, 7, 8 months for any news to travel from Leadenhall Street to the traders on the ground.
And that distance is, I think, very important in shaping how the British act in India. British people like Clive's audience is in London. He's trying to think about what kind of great heroic deeds can he perform that will get him a good story, get him good press in London.
Get him into Parliament.
And get him into Parliament. I'm always thinking, hold on a minute, they're plotting against me, they're conspiring against me, there are people who are out to do me, and there's that 6 months time gap. So you get these big
It's like
dramatic...
Shashi in the UN.
Your big dramatic acts, conquest, war, etc. A lot of that is about kind of projecting an image back to Britain.
Linda, in your wonderful book Captives, which you talked about with Sunil Kanani yesterday, you emphasised that at the beginning that the East India Company armies have no monopoly on success or sort of high-tech weaponry, that many of the company battles are lost, that Tipu, the Marathas, all defeat the company. And at one point, I think 1/4 of the British troops in India are actually imprisoned in Srirangapatnam.
Yes, it's estimated that in the early 1780s, perhaps 1 in 5 British-born troops in the Indian subcontinent are captives in Mysore. Because, again, you come to the very small numbers. You come to the fact that before the early 19th century, the British, like other Western empires, do not have a technological advantage on land. They do at sea. But of course, there's a limit to what you can do in a country as vast as this from the sea. And British power, if we can use that term, British power in the Indian subcontinent for a long time remains concentrated around the edge, which is where the Navy can train its guns. But the interior, very often they don't know much about, and you can see that in some of the East India Company's maps of the subcontinent in the last third of the 18th century. There's large parts of the interior, they don't know where the roads are, they don't know what the rivers are, because they haven't made contact there. They don't have the technology and the reach.
Now, in 1771, there's a huge famine in Bengal. The company has raped Bengal so thoroughly and in a sense inefficiently that it's killed the goose that lays the golden egg. And the weavers are not producing, with or without their thumbs. There's a huge famine, dead bodies filling the Hooghly. And as a result, the company's share price, which has rocketed after Plassey, and everyone in Parliament is making huge killings, and all the shareholders are doing very well, 12% dividends, enormous parties all round. Suddenly, there's no money at all, and the share price drops. And in a thing that's very like the financial crisis of 10 years ago, one trader in air disappears out the country because he's gone bankrupt, and the 13 banks fall in the next month, bank after bank, like dominoes. And the East India Company is left with a debt of, I think it's £3 million, which is half the British national product. John, maybe you could talk about this. It is, by this stage, too big to fail.
As we've said already, politicians kind of throughout Britain have shares in the East India Company, and there's a kind of reputational sense, I think. Britain is constantly worried about its sort of like local European rivals, and it doesn't want this kind of hugely important organisation to to collapse. And so remember that kind of in the sort of 17th and early 18th century, it was the East India Company that was bankrolling the British state. The days when it was a relatively profitable trader. By the kind of late 18th century, kind of after 1771, it's the British state that needs to bail out the East India Company. And you begin to get this kind of the two, British government and the East India Company begin to get embroiled in the kind of ways in which John was describing.
Rather like the British government buying out NatWest.
Exactly.
The financial crash.
The fate of them both is the same. They're separate interests. It's still possible within Britain to be very critical of the company, but by that stage, the company is, as you say, too big to fail.
And so you then go on to the whole impeachment of Warren Hastings. Shashi, you've written very well about this. Maybe you'd like to talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically there was this confronting within Britain of the horrendous behavior of the East India Company, and in particular the rapacity, the exaction, the loot that took place. Warren Hastings was, if you like, made the fall guy. He was doing what everyone before him had done, and he was certainly arguably not by any means the worst, but he was seen as typical of these exactions. By the way, much of what Hastings had done, he had done with the full complicity of the East India Company's board of directors. He would, on occasion, for example, extort money from principalities he was conquering and give a large share of it to the board of directors to get their permission to keep a chunk for himself. So the British were, when I say the British, I mean every Briton involved, whether he was East India Company official, a parliamentarian, or somebody sitting in London, were in it for the money. And there was really no doubt about what their motives were. I think John was being a bit too kind in saying that the bad period ended after 20 years, because in fact they sowed the seeds, even if a lot of the subsequent extortion was not quite as blunt and direct, it continued well after this 20-year period. There are examples I've cited in the book of Rajas being told, for instance, that they would need to accept a large number of British-led troops for their own protection.
Shashi.
And then they would have to pay a substantial sum of money
My
for that. This is
point
exactly
wasn't-
the tactic the mafia uses today.
My point wasn't that the iniquities and the injustices were discontinued
Right.
as of 1780. My point was that they were responsibility of the British government. The government took over the company in 1784.
De facto.
Set up a board of control to superintend, direct and control the government of the company's possessions.
Right.
So we're falling into the sort of trap that they laid for us. We're laying into the East India Company when in fact the East India Company was just being used as a scapegoat for the British government.
Correct, but there was a continuity of practices of misbehavior and of
yes,
loot which continued
I
under either label.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So then we move forward into the 19th century. The spice trade is over. The triangular trade, growing opium, the stuff Amitav Ghosh writes about in The Sea of Poppies, growing opium in Bihar, selling it illegally in China, buying Chinese tea, selling that in London and New York. But at the same time, we have growing Indian resistance. John, do you want to talk about the lead up to 1857? Why suddenly you get a continual resistance, but why does it reach a peak towards the 1850s?
The British state is unstable throughout the early 19th century. We have this idea that there's a moment in the 1800s when suddenly India is conquered. That's it. The British can just get on with peacefully running India. That's not true. There are kind of pockets of resistance everywhere throughout the subcontinent. There's a constant sort of bargaining process, where the British, there's resistance in one place. The British get the support of another ruler to help against the original foe, and then the new ally falls out of favour with the British too. And so the British state is kind of expanding in this unstable way. It's constantly feeling that it's endangered, and the only way in which it thinks it can actually secure itself is to expand territorially. And that kind of means that you end up with this kind of new kind of attempt to create this kind of centralised kind of government, I suppose, that sort of generates kind of increasing resistance. And if you look at the arguments that the rebels make in 1857, it's because they're opposing a new form of power that is projecting itself as this homogeneous political force that is going to abolish the differences between different groups of Indians, make everyone basically into a soldier of the East India Company, and help, and force the population to become soldiers who all have to eat the same food, kind of spend all their time together, etc., and all the kind of different social differences, cultural differences, which is what India in many ways was all about, get obliterated, and that's what 1857 is resistance to. It's resistance to the idea that kind of Indian culture and Indian ways of life are going to be kind of flattened by the company. Now, I don't think the company had the capacity to do that. It's not strong enough. But it's projecting an image and an idea that it might.
So the last, and in a sense, probably the very worst chapter of the company's history in this country is what happens after, at the end of 1857. It's always one of the great mysteries to me that everyone remembers Jallianwala Bagh. What were the casualties there, Shashi, in Jallianwala Bagh?
Well, the British claim 1379, the Indians claim slightly more, but
under 2,000.
Oh, yeah.
So Jallianwala Bagh is under 2,000. The casualties in Delhi alone on the 18th of September 1857, they lock the gates of Delhi. Put troops around everyone, around Turkman Gate, Delhi Gate, all the Ajmeri Gate, and they authorize the murder of every male above the age of 16. So there are deaths on a scale of in Delhi alone, certainly tens of thousands. If you count what happens in a very similar massacre in Lucknow and in Kanpur, we're probably heading towards at least 100,000 deaths by the end of 1857. Some people have used figures of up to 1 million, which I think is stretching it slightly, but it is massive casualties, and the whole of North India's demographic changes in the years after. So it is so this company, which has started trading in spices, has grown increasingly aggressive throughout, ends with a full-scale genocide. Why, Linda, is it finally wound up? What prompts the British government to say enough is enough?
I think a variety of factors. I mean, what's emerged from all the comments is that the East India Company was controversial from the beginning, though it was also used as a cop-out, this is quite right, by British politicians, British people, getting a profit. But of course, one of the things that is happening by the late 1850s, well, there's a whole variety of things are happening. For a start, technology is completely different. The scale of the casualties are partly tribute is the wrong word, partly a result of much faster rifles, the fact that you've got trains being able to ship soldiers around. So that's one side. The mechanisms of repression and violence are there in a new way. But so, of course, is journalism. India, of course, one of the great centres of print already in 1800. Kolkata is one of the great centres of print in the world. And the East India Company likes print to an extent because it uses it. But if you have all this print around, what is happening in places like Delhi gets reported, it gets picked up in different parts of the world because there are foreign correspondents.
A precursor,
now.
in a sense, of Twitter today. Suddenly everyone can broadcast.
This is not the image of themselves that the British want. So I think there's many other factors, but I think the level of technological change is something we've got to factor in throughout this long and lurid story.
Shashi, last word to you. In 1858, the East India Company is half wound up. It then, I think, lingers on for another 10 or 15 years, but its administrative functions are removed from it. What follows is direct rule from London. Is that any better, or is that even worse?
It's a continuity, but with a different justification. I think John is right that the British government was already pretty much controlling what was happening in India, that India was de facto a colony. It was nominally ruled by the British East India Company, but the British government had a strong say in everything that was going on. And after 1858, they removed the pretense of the company and made it direct with Queen Victoria's proclamation. But I would say that though a lot of the justificatory language became different, the substance did not change significantly. As I've described in the book, one example was when the Queen Victoria, having heard, and this was very much mentioned in a number of House of Commons testimonies through the 1840s and 50s, that Indians resented not being associated with the administration of their own country, Queen Victoria says in her proclamation that she'll open up the administration to Indians. But then you discover that in fact, in practice, the intention is not to give the Indians any real power or authority. And when Indians manage on their own ability to get into, for example, the Imperial Civil Service, later the Indian Civil Service, what do they do? They're either given extremely insignificant positions or treated with such appalling racism and marginalization that very often they resign or are drummed out of the service. So the first few entrants all have a terrible time in trying to cope with the ICS. So I would say the justifications changed. A lot of the sort of talk about being there for the benefit of the Indians and trying to sort of talk about the civilizing mission. We don't see any of that before 1858 much, but we do see a lot of it in the 1870s and 80s, whereas in the private correspondence, what you're seeing is a complete and honest admission. That's not really what British rule is about.
The final word has to be that, of course, today the East India Company is owned by an Indian, a Gujarati. It was
the brand name has been bought by an Indian, yes.
It was refounded about 15 years ago and now sells condiments, as it describes itself on its website, and fine teas. So if any of you are passing through Terminal 5, you'll be able to buy very expensive tea at a rip-off price, continuing this long tradition of ripping off.
And no longer by appointment to Her Majesty.
Ladies and gentlemen, please a big round of applause. Shashi Tharoor, Linda Colley, John Keay, Giles Milton, and John Wilson. We have time for about 2 questions. Lady in an orange jersey here, standing here. Can we have a microphone to this lady, please? Next one here.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Just want to say that I can understand what happened, horrific. I can understand why it happened. How did it happen? How did it happen that a small company, 35 people, millions of miles away, no communication, a big country with everything on our side, aesthetically, culturally, spiritually, numbers, everything going for us. How did it happen? Would you say it had something to do with the Indian psyche and our nature? And also, I feel that for many years, not only did the British destroy us economically and every other way, what was even worse and almost unforgivable on our side is that they actually destroyed our psyche to a certain extent.
Shashi, do you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, I think there's no question that we had been weakened by the time the British made their most significant military advances. We didn't have a strong military capacity to offer in return. Certainly, the British artillery was superior. They knew how to use guns. They had weapons. We still had very old-fashioned methods of fighting. And our armies in pretty much every battle were outclassed by the skills of the numerically inferior British. Then you had the undoubted fact that there was a lot of dissension and betrayal going on. Not only were we divided in terms of multiple principalities and so on, but we were divided within these principalities. People had a tendency to put their personal interests above those of the collectivity that they were sworn to defend. And so they were quite willing to sell themselves out to the British in hope of certain personal advantages. And this happened right through. It went on right up to Tipu Sultan in the late 18th century when in Seringapatam, for example, he had built this magnificent moat full of water and crocodiles that the besieging British could not have crossed. But there were passages underground to allow supplies to come in and out. And one of those passages was actually betrayed by an Indian to the British. And in fact, that's how they came in. You can still go and see it today in Seringapatam, south of Mysore, where the tourist guide said to me, "Sir, second Watergate, Washington. First Watergate, Seringapatam." Because Watergate was lifted so the British would come through. So we betrayed ourselves also a great deal right throughout.
These Shashi Tharoor, Linda Colley, John Keay, Giles Milton, and John Wilson. Everyone will be signing their books, so come and buy lots of them. No profits go to the East India Company, we promise.
Thank you very much. Giles Milton, John Keay, John Wilson, Linda Colley, Shashi Tharoor, William Dalrymple and Amity University. Shashi Tharoor will be